Okay, let's just open with a word of prayer, and then we're going to roll up our sleeves, and we're going to go hard till break, and then to lunch. And my greatest fear this morning is that we won't get through everything. So you can make a mental note of this. I will send you all my notes if you email me. So whatever I'm going to have here in this pile, I'm happy to send that to you as well. All you have to do is say, send me the notes from Summer Institute. All right, I'm happy to do that. So if we don't get through all of it, at least you will get a copy of my notes. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we come here this morning focusing on youth culture, and it just seems to be a bit of a mess these days for a lot of the kids that we're working with. And we want to dig into your scriptures and build a biblical foundation for engaging them in a Christian manner. And so we've got a lot on our plate. And so I would just ask that your Spirit might come and open our hearts and our ears and fill us with your wisdom and take the ramblings of an old ministry vet and make it come alive in the hearts and the minds of my young friends sitting here. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so I'm assuming that you have a handout in your binder and you're kind of tracking with me. If I miss something, don't hesitate to point out that I've missed, but I think I've got everything here. 1.1 says to the Amazon. So here's how I always start when we talk about engaging the culture. I want you to visualize your community, where you're from. Some of you are from other countries. I want you to think about all the kids that you drive by that you don't necessarily come to your programs, or probably don't come to your programs. They're hanging out on the street corners, they're in the coffee shops, they're wherever. And what we're going to do is we're going to gather them all up, and we're going to meet at the Toronto Harbor, and we're going to put them on a boat, and we're going to take them down to South America. We're going to drive up the Amazon till we hit the source of the Amazon and our boat cannot go any further. And then we're going to push them all out on shore. And then we're going to get back in the boat and come back and be in church on Sunday morning. And somebody will say to you, and how was your week? And you'll say, well, you won't believe the week I had. We discovered that there is a new tribe living at the mouth of the Amazon River. And you won't believe the music they listen to. You won't believe the technology and how much time they spend on their screens. You won't believe the lack of sexual values that they have and their beliefs about life, and they don't believe in God, and their social structures are just, we've never seen anything like it. And the church will say to you, well, what do we need to do then for this new tribe? And you and the church will say, we need to send them a missionary, right? And so if we were to send you as a missionary to that tribe down along the Amazon River, we would send you to training school, missionary training school, and we would teach you about the social structures of this group, the customs of this group, the values, the beliefs, the attitudes, the behaviors, and so that when you go to minister to this lost tribe of young people at the mouth of the Amazon, you will be able to intellectually and theologically engage them properly. Now, what I've never figured about the local church is this. If we would do that for that scenario and for that group of kids, why don't we do it for the lost kids in our neighborhood? It just seems that there's a double standard within the church. If you were to go and to minister to the lost tribe at the Amazon, we would train and equip you to understand their culture and to engage it properly. And yet when they live in your neighborhood and hang around at your stores and you walk around them all the time, we don't do any of that. In fact, the church by and large has always kind of shunned that. And I'm here to suggest this morning, and I'll build a brief theological foundation for it, that we need to understand them in order to engage them, and to do some things that Jesus did, and to do some things that Paul did in Acts 17. Now, in 1.2, it says your ministry effectiveness depends on knowing the culture. Now, let me back up, because I wanted to share with you smart technology from when I was growing up. So this is me on the left with my teddy bear, my friend Joanne and her brother Carl. And Carl just died a couple months ago, but he was an old buddy. But the reason I have this picture is this is a radio. This huge thing, that was a radio. You only got AM and shortwave. If you flipped on the shortwave button, you could sometimes hear people on the other side of the world as shortwaves bounced off the atmosphere, especially at night, and you could hear all kinds of things, never knowing where they were coming from. But that was my idea of a radio. And trust me, you could not take that thing with you. You could not carry it around. And then now this is my cousin Darwin, and this thing back in here, and this is why I always normally use my own projector, because I know what it will look like when I get it up here. But this is a TV. It has two dials. It's got a channel dial and then a volume dial. We got 3 channels out of Detroit. And probably most of you don't know that my dad actually invented the remote control in 1957 when he said, Paul, get up and go over to the TV and change the channel and turn the volume up a little while you're there. And then the aerial was outside the window. You would crank the window open and manually turn the aerial if you wanted to get a station out of Cleveland. So that was television and radio technology. This is me age 5. And as you saw from that picture in the handout or in your binder, I had 5 incredibly difficult years at high school when you look like that. And it was not easy. When my 4 boys first saw that picture, they said almost in unison, Dad, you really were a loser in high school. So anyway. Anyway, back to technology. Then I had a transistor radio. This was pretty cutting edge. And you had one little earbud that would pop in it. You had that really cool leather case. And you could get AM. Again, there were no FM stations. I used to listen to CKLW out of Windsor, Ontario, the Tom Shannon show every night. And you would get the top 40s kind of thing. And then for cameras, this was pretty much what my dad had. And you would put a flash bulb in it. And it had a roll of film in it, and you would take the pictures and send them away, and 2 weeks later your pictures would come back, and you know, they would look like your typical pictures. Those are from Columbine in 1999. I'll come back to those. And you never know whether you had a good picture or not. And I can remember some very disappointing times when my mom or dad thought they had the perfect picture and the film had been exposed or whatever. So that was photography. This is my dad. My dad died just a little over a year ago. He was just over 100 years old. So I said to him, you don't owe us anything. You've given us 100 years. But this is my record player on his desk. And that was from 1967. And so you could play the LPs or the 45, but you had to put the little insert in the 45, and you could only play them one at a time, and there was no bass or treble control. You just turned the volume up or down, and again, you had the little AM radio on the front. And then this was our idea of really cutting-edge technology called a typewriter. And this is what I learned to type on. And when I was a high school teacher, I taught grade 9 typing. And the machines were a little bit more modern than that one. And then this is an old family picture, but I want you to see right behind my mom is a rotary phone on the wall. And I can remember explaining to my boys that, you know, when I was their age, I had a party line. And my guys went, Dad, a party line? You didn't tell us you had a party line. I said, no, party was still a noun back when I was growing up, not a party as a verb for your generation. It meant we shared it with 2 other people. And so they had trouble getting their head around that. And then here I am on the phone talking to my girlfriend, Leanne Brown, probably 1968. And to get privacy, I had to pull that cord through that door behind my mom. That was the utility room, and close the door and hope that she couldn't hear my conversation. That's about as far as away you could get from the phone. And then the neighbors would pick up the phone if you were on it a long time. They'd start clicking it, or they would. I remember Mrs. Treva next door going, I'm coming over there to tell your parents how long you've been on the phone. As soon as they get home, then she slammed the phone down 3 or 4 times. And so that was, you know, smart technology that I was growing up with. You couldn't take any of it out of the house. You couldn't carry it on your back or do any of that kind of stuff. You couldn't take pictures with anything other than the camera. You couldn't make a phone call on anything other than the phone, and so forth and so on. And so my, how things have changed. So now we're back to your youth ministry effectiveness. depends on three principles. Number one is know the unchanging Word. I think the greatest challenge for us as youth workers is to make sure we're spending time in the Word. Now, I brought this morning. This is going to be one of these things, and it's in a plastic container. This is going to be one of those things that when I'm dead and my kids are cleaning out my office space in the back room, they're going to go, why in the world did Dad keep this? This is a 26-month study of the Gospel of John, over 72,000 words. And that's my idea of doing a Bible study. So I'm not big at devotions, but I am big at studying the Word. And currently I've been in the book of Mark for just over a year. And I ran into a lady not long ago who was at Hastings Park Church in Belleville the day I became a Christian. And she said to me, you know, I still remember the day you came to Christ, and I still remember the passion you had as soon as you became a Christian for studying the Word. And I said, well, you know, Marilyn, things haven't changed. I've had one Bible for 40 years. This was purchased in Belleville in 1978. And I said, I still have this passion for studying the Word. And I was thinking when I was driving over here, how have I lasted 40 years in ministry? One of the things that I would say that has worked is that I've tried to stay connected to God through the study of the Word. And so, you know, how can we take the life-changing message of Jesus Christ to the kids that God has called us to work with if we're not really deep in the Scriptures and building ourselves up and staying connected to God? And I think the more you are in the Word, the more passion you will have for the lost kids of your community. And so I don't bring that out to brag. I just bring it out to say, hey, you know, if you don't do anything else, stay deep in God's Word, and He will honor and bless that. So that's the first thing you need to know. The second one, you need to know changing kids in their changing world. And so, you know, I study the culture, I read, I spend a lot of money on books, and obviously if you hit me up, I'll spend even more money on books. And I'm just fascinated. People say, when are you going to retire? I said, I'm going to retire when I wake up one morning and I no longer have a deep interest in what's going on in youth culture. So I just turned 66, and according to the TD Bank, I need to stick around for a few more years to pay off the mortgage that I have left. And so at the back of your handout, I've put a resource page of books and websites and those kinds of things. And so, you know, I try to understand, like I don't understand how technology works. If my computer breaks, I call one of my 4 sons. But I understand how technology shapes and influences our kids. And so that's what we're focused on today. And then the challenge then becomes, how do we take the unchanging Word to changing kids and their changing culture? That's the challenge. You see, because all too often we try to do number 3 while bypassing number 2. So how can we have intellectual conversations with kids in the marketplace if we don't know their world? We are crossing cultures. We need to know what they are thinking. How can you connect with them if you don't know their language, if you don't know their music, if you don't know their media, if you don't know their points of contact or the issues or their values or the hot buttons in the culture today, most of it centered around technology? And then here's the challenge. How do you bring the Scriptures to bear and make them relevant to whatever these issues are that we're engaging kids within the culture on? How do you have an intelligent conversation? How do you take whatever issue your kid is struggling with and bring Jesus to bear on that? Now, I've said this for 30 years, and everybody laughs, and you feel free to laugh too, but I've said for 30 years that Jesus is like polyfiller. So when you do home renos or you want to fix a crack or a nail hole in the wall, you put some polyfiller in it, right? And I've always thought that that's kind of like Jesus. Because every kid you're working with has a hole or a crack in his or her life. And the answer becomes, what did Jesus say or do that would interest my friend and fill that hole or fill that crack in their life? And that's the challenge. We know the culture, but then how do we bring God's Word to bear on that? You see, you can put a kid in a room with someone who is an A, B, or a C, and they will be attracted to B all the time. Because kids want people who understand their world, who understand their culture. Now, in a lot of ways, I'm speaking to the choir because we have the privilege of being out there in the marketplace. You know, in the early years, I had all kinds of invitations to be a youth pastor, and I turned them all down. I couldn't think of anything more boring than being a youth pastor. Now, if you're sitting here and you're a youth pastor, I apologize. But you know, why would I want to be a youth pastor and sit in my office when I can be out in the marketplace with kids? And in my 40 years of ministry experience, the two biggest complaints I've had from kids is that we as adults and we as the church, we do not listen, and we certainly don't understand their world. And so we try to understand and then bring good news to bear on whatever it is that they're facing. And trust me, your world of young people is much more complicated than the one that I started with in 1980. When I assumed that every kid in my high school showed up to church at least twice a year, Christmas and Easter. But for most of your kids, they've never darkened the door of the church. And so how do we study their culture? How do we engage their culture and do all of that? And some of you might be thinking, well, I'm asking you to defile yourself by looking at and engaging in and having these conversations. I'm not asking you to do anything that the Apostle Paul didn't do and that Jesus didn't do. I mean, Jesus had a great testimony, didn't he? He was a glutton, Jesus was a drunkard, and Jesus hung around with whores. Great testimony for the Son of God to have. But why was that? It's because he was engaged in the culture. And doing those things was not sinful. And Paul, who wrote Acts, also said in Ephesians 5:11, and this is my personal mission statement that people ask me, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. Now, most of you are familiar with that. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. But that's only half of that scripture. Nobody ever finishes it. Here it is from the Amplified. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them for what they are. That's why I do what I do, is to look at culture, to look at how it shapes our kids, and to expose the darkness behind so much of what our kids are involved in. And so that's why we need to know the culture. That's why your ministry will be effective when you make this part of the process. Paul's motivation. So what motivated Paul to engage the people of Athens the way that he did? Well, I think there were three things that drove Paul. One was his deep sense of concern. Paul looked around Athens and realized that here was a culture that was perishing physically and spiritually. And I look at the youth culture today and go, nothing has changed. I was at Columbine 3 weeks after the shooting back in 1999. That's Cassie Bernal's cross, Christian girl. Policeman who found her body said she was under a table. Her hands were almost in a praise-like position with a slight smile on her face. And that's the girl that Dylan Klebold had said to her, do you believe in God? And she said, yes, and he shot her. I've got other pictures from here of Rachel Scott's car. And I said, and the reason I point this out, is that I said in 1999, and I've been saying since then, that we are only beginning to see the tip of the iceberg when it comes to violence amongst our young people. And I think, you know, almost 20 years ago, people thought I was silly or being extremist or whatever. And then you look at the United States of America, who has averaged a school shooting every week this year. And you cannot sow into the hearts and the minds of our kids this idea of violence and no boundaries for your life and no truth to live by. And think that things are going to turn out right, because they won't. And so Paul had this deep sense of concern for his culture, and we should too. Paul had a deep sense of responsibility. He says in Romans, I am obligated to proclaim the gospel. When you are deep in God's word, you will have this sense of obligation to share the truth about Jesus. I am not convinced that that we're doing as much of this evangelism stuff as we should be. I see a lot of social justice within Youth for Christ, and that's fine and dandy, but social justice is an outcrop of lives changed by the gospel of Jesus. And it isn't social justice that's going to change the lives of your kids, and it isn't social justice that's going to change the world. It's Jesus that's going to change the world. So his sense of responsibility was to share Christ in an intelligent way. I'm a big fan of Ravi Zacharias. I like Ravi because he's a bit of an intellect. I actually had 2 hours with him one time. He wanted to know what I was teaching on postmodern youth culture. And I went into his office and we sat down and we chatted and I went through the 10 points I was teaching on postmodern youth culture. And Ravi looked at me and he said, well, Paul, you know the answer to this is quite simple, don't you? Now, when Ravi Zacharias says the answer is quite simple, I'm pretty well assured I'm not going to understand anything he says. And so I grabbed the side of my chair, and he said the answer is that we simply have to get kids engaged in serving others, in giving their lives away. That's the key, but they will only do that once they come to know Jesus and they break with the world. But Ravi said in one of his lectures that I've listened to, I can tell spiritually how any person is doing with asking one question. Here's the question. Are you studying the Word of God? And Ravi says, without exception, and I know this is true in my life, you are either studying and growing or you're struggling. There's no in between. That's why I emphasize the importance of you being in the Word. In whatever system works for you. My system basically is this. I'm up at 5:30. I'm at my desk with my coffee at 5:45. I do a 45-minute study, or a little bit longer if I get my journaling. I've kept a journal for over 30 years. And then I go to the gym for an hour, and I come back and have breakfast, and then go back down to my office. Now, do I do that every day? Of course not. I didn't do it this morning because I'm here with you folks. But just the importance of being in the Word. So either you're studying or you're struggling. I agree with Ravi, there's no exception. So I challenge you to stay in the Word. And then his last motivation was this sense of gratitude that he had. You know, after the Damascus Road experience, Paul was a changed man, and he was always grateful for that. And it reminds all of us that no one, including all the kids you're working with, are beyond God's redemption. I became a Christian January 22nd, 1978, the first time I ever heard the gospel. And the night before, my wife had a vision of Satan appear in our car as we were driving. I was driving, she was looking at Satan. And he was claiming me, I've got him and God will never get him, and so forth and so on. And she had learned through Huntley Street that she could rebuke him. And she didn't tell me this story till about 8 months later, and some of you have heard this story, so you can have a mental break and not listen to the rest of it. But you know, she asked me the next morning, do you want to go to Hastings Park Bible Chapel? And I went and became a Christian. And then 8 or 9 months later, she said, you remember where you were the night before you became a Christian? I said, yeah, we were at Chuck McWhirter's house for a high school teacher's party, and I didn't get drunk. Probably the first time I was ever out, and I didn't get drunk. And I thought driving home, she never spoke to me all the way home. I thought you were angry at me about something. And I was in this house 3 weeks ago. It was the first house I ever owned. We still go back to visit it. And I'm sitting in the very room where she told me this story so long ago. And she just talked about how, you know, she had this vision of Satan in the fuel gauge. He looked like God, long white hair, fluffy white beard, fluffy white eyebrows, but his skin was dead gray, and his eyes burned with evil. And she said, I knew in my spirit it was Satan. And so she said, when I would rebuke him, the vision would fade, and when I wouldn't, he would come right back at you going, I've got him, he's mine, God will never get him. And it was the next morning, it was 12 hours, less than 12 hours later, I would come into the kingdom. A sense of gratitude. Where would I be if that hadn't happened? Where would you be if you hadn't come to Christ? And you know, the best is yet to come when we get home to glory. Right now we enjoy participating in the building of the kingdom. Our sense of gratitude for what Jesus has done for us should drive us into the marketplace to be with these kids. All right. Move. There. All right. Two scriptures, two verses from Acts 17. When I teach a full course at a Bible college, I always find it hilarious. I've never been to Bible college. I have no theological training other than my almost 40 years of doing it. And I write everything in my Bible that I get to come and talk about Acts 17. And it says this, two verses. Now, if I teach a full course, this is a 3-hour lecture. So what I've done is I've taken about 15 hours of material and just skimmed off the top the best 2 hours. So my apologies for that. But I'm thankful just to be here. Brett always calls me, in March or April and he says, Robbie, we couldn't get a good speaker for Tuesday morning. Are you available? So I'm here.
And then I say, we have some daily objectives. And then you say, it doesn't matter, I'm going to do what I want.
I did. But Brett trusts me. I think we're pretty close to our objectives. 2 verses, and that's all the time we'll have time for this morning. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with those who happened to be there, or with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. And I have a number of those words marked up, which I want to just kind of take a few minutes and share with you about. So Paul is in Athens. He'd just been kicked out of Thessalonica for preaching the gospel. He gets into Athens. If I had been Paul, I would have checked into the Holiday Inn with the pool and relaxed. Not Paul. He's out in the marketplace, checking things out. And he's out doing what would get you kicked out of most churches today. He's in the pubs. He's at the theater. He's engaging the people in the marketplace. And he's studying and he's looking at things that the church says you shouldn't look at. And what Paul did was he first got into their heads and their hearts. He got into their heads and their hearts. And this is important for us to remember. He closed his mouth, he opened his eyes, and he engaged them in conversation. He wasn't prejudiced against them. He looked at their culture, he looked at whatever they might have had for media or technology, and he's studying it. And we look at all this stuff, and I look at what's going on in the world of media and technology. And I don't do it for entertainment purposes. I do it because I want to find a place where I can connect Jesus into their marketplace, into their lives. And I want to know what attracts our kids to this stuff. What attracts kids to screens? Why are they always looking at their phones or their iPads or their iPods? And why are they living their lives like that? Over the years, I've gone to a lot of music concerts over the years. Those are field trips for me. I remember being at Avril Lavigne's concert. I'm 55 years old. I'm the oldest guy in Toronto AC Center. And this little 15-year-old girl and her friend who was 13 who never stopped screaming the whole time. And I'm asking God, how can little girls scream for an hour without taking a breath? It's just, Well, at one point, Avril Lavigne, her band takes a break, but she just goes to the piano. She didn't take a break. And these girls asked me, what are you doing here? You're pretty old. And I had a chance to explain to them that that's a field trip for me. I went to see what she was singing about, what her messages and her music were. And I've been to Eminem, I've been to Limp Bizkit, Papa Roach, Bob Dylan, and I know all Bob Dylan songs. And last time I heard him, I couldn't understand a word he was singing. And I've been to U2 with my son, and I've seen Tony Bennett 3 times because I like really good vocals, and Michael Bublé and so forth. But most of those are field trips for me to understand what kids are into. And what I'm trying to find is that spiritual point where we can engage them in a conversation. And I've said for the last 25 years, any of your kids that come to your ministries who have tattoos, ask them a very simple question. Tell me the story behind your tattoo. Because kids tattoo personal stories on their bodies, and they want you to ask them about it. And I can remember a few years ago walking out of the grocery store in Brampton where I live, this girl in front of me on her back, it was the summertime, it was a hot day, I know the weather's going to be hot whenever they have Summer Institute, because the hottest days of May are always when this thing is happening, like yesterday. So this girl has on her back right shoulder blade a blue hand with a red heart in here with white starburst coming out of it. And I'm walking behind her and I said, tell me the story behind your tattoo. And she turns around to me and she said, what did you say? I said, tell me the story behind your tattoo. I don't know who this girl, I know who she is now after some investigation. And she looks at me and she puts her head down and she won't look me in the eye. And she said, that's my hand reaching out to a God that I don't even know if he's there. I don't even know if there is a God, but that's my hand reaching out. And I said, cool. And then I said, well, what's with that little red heart and the white starburst thing? And she said, I don't know if there is a God, but that is my hand reaching out to God, and I have my heart and my hand hoping that God will find it. And I said, cool. Now, here's a little tip for you. For the last 70 years, the only jargon in teen language that still means the same is the word cool. So I go with cool. It covers, it hasn't changed. You don't go peachy keen or groovy or any of those ones. They don't work. But cool works. And so she's telling me about how she's hoping that this is her hand reaching out to God that she doesn't know, and hopes that God has her heart in his hand. And then she said, in a lot of ways, that's God's hand reaching out to me and taking my heart. And I said, cool. And I just left it at that. I thought, well, this is my local grocery store. I'll run into her again. And for the next few years, I looked and looked and looked and never ran into her again. But I do know this. Her name is Candace McPherson, and she speaks on behalf of a lot of kids who say, I don't know if there's a God out there. I'm trying to get to him. I want to connect. And I think she is reflective of this spiritual emptiness in the kids that you're working with, and what a wonderful opportunity you have to deal with them. Now, let me give you a few nuggets of gold. I think I forgot to put this first one on, so you're going to have to add this one, and it's the word greatly distressed. So it says that Paul was greatly distressed, and it comes from a Greek word parazino, which is actually a medical term, and it was used of a seizure or an epileptic fit. So when Paul was greatly distressed, he was almost on the verge of having a seizure. It means to be upset or provoked at someone or something involving severe emotional concern. In the Amplified Version of the Bible, it says, his spirit was grieved and roused to anger as he saw the city was full of idols, and that anger is the anger of a wild, unbridled horse. Paul was furious. Paul was distressed. Paul was greatly anxious. Let me ask you this question. When is the last time you looked at the youth culture in your community and your spirit was roused to anger because you saw the lostness of the kids that you're trying to reach? I'm betting a lot of us will say, well, we do our ministry, but it's been a while since I felt that strongly about it. But we come back to the scripture, we come back to how did Paul engage the culture. It ticked Paul off, it upset him. And so we need to have that as well. And please note that Paul was not offended by the culture, Paul was distressed by the culture. And there's a big difference. His distress in what he saw led Paul to engage the culture. So much of the church today is offended by what they see in the culture, and it drives them away. So distress drives you to it. Offense drives you away. Being offended by the culture makes it hard to connect. If all we're going to do is be offended by the heathens, and to be honest with you, I've always found the pagan kids much more interesting than the church kids. That's one of my weaknesses. That to be offended, we can't stand to be near them. And yet Paul, in his distress, looked for those points of contact and ways to engage. And the other difference for Paul's distress was very much God-centered. It broke his heart. He wanted to tell them about the unknown God. When you're offended by it, that is a sign of self-centeredness. Because here's another little simple question for you. Are you as offended by your own sin as you are by the sins you see in the kids that you're ministering to and that you think are beyond God's redemption? Now, probably not, because that's what we do at Youth Unlimited, right? But for most people in the church, they're offended by the youth culture, and you know, and that's self-centered, because they're not offended by their own sin, but they're offended. These kids can't come to the church till they clean up their act. Well, are you as offended by your own sin, your own lies, your own deceit, what you do at business, what you look online? No. And so there's a big difference in those two. You see, I think most Christians today can look at the idols that are leading our kids astray and yawn. They are just so distant from it. They are just so indifferent to it. And I think that we can become indifferent because it just becomes a job. And heaven forbid that this becomes a job for us. This is our passion. This is our calling. And again, I bring you back to nurturing that through God's Word. I remember being in Birmingham, Michigan. You know, and I'm out on the street Friday night. I don't speak till Saturday. And I'm walking by a group of kids. Birmingham, Michigan is the head office of General Motors. And there's hundreds and hundreds of kids on the street, barely saw an adult. And I'm walking down the street, and as I walk by this little cluster of guys, they're looking in my same direction at these two little girls that are coming locked arm in arm, which means they're junior high girls, because senior high girls don't link arms, but junior high girls are okay with that. And they're saying to these two little girls, "Are you the girls that were kissing earlier?" And they're going, "Now they're right here." And they're going, "Yeah, why? Do you want to see us kiss?" And he says, "Yeah." Now they're behind me, so I don't want to, do this. So I make my cool youth culture observation move and lean up against the wall and put my leg up like that. And here's these two little junior high girls making out with all the passion of a heterosexual couple. And my heart broke. It just broke. Because these little girls don't understand sexuality. They don't understand what it means to be a lesbian and all this kind of stuff. And it was one of those moments when I was angry and greatly distressed. But I don't have enough of those times. And I'm sure you don't have enough of those times. But we're in a war. We're in a war to reach these kids with truth. So Paul's reaction was rage, but he remained restrained and he remained respectful, which are also two good lessons for us. And then you have that little word in verse 17, the word so. In my Bible, it's circled. I love the little words of the Bible that most people overlook, like so and then and but. Those are great words. It means because of what has gone on before. Because of what Paul has seen in the culture, there's going to be a change. He has an observation that is going to require action. And so when we look at their culture, we have to come to action. We have to do something about it. And it implies that there was almost the most natural thing for Paul to do was to begin engaging them in conversations. And then you have the word reasoned, which in Greek means a proclamation of truth, but it leaves room for discussion. I used to go to the meeting house in Oakville and Bruxy Cavey, and he always ends, and they still do, with question and answers. It's called Q&A, but A is spelled E-H with a question mark because we're Canadian, eh? And it's that dialogue kind of thing. So it isn't a one-way communication. It's a two-way communication. And so when we're trying to engage kids in culture, we need to know what the hot points are and what they're struggling with and what Jesus has to say. And then how do we have a meaningful conversation to bring biblical truth into their lives a little bit at a time. I'm not talking Bible thumping. Sowing some seed, building those relationships with kids. I have a friend at the gym. I haven't seen him. He's a year older than I am. The last book I gave him was Ravi Zacharias. He's an atheist. The last book I gave him to read was Ravi Zacharias' new one called Jesus Among Secular Gods, because I wanted him to critique Ravi's chapter on atheism, because he's an atheist. And his name was Carly. I said, "Carly, you're an atheist. I have a friend, Ravi, he's written this book, but what does he know about atheism? Yeah, I want you to critique it." And I gave it to him just after Christmas time. And then about 2 months now, he dropped off the face of the earth. I've checked We don't think he's died, but I don't care if I get the book back. I'm just trying to get Carly into the kingdom kind of thing. So it's that dialogue that Carly and I would have the last couple of years in the gym. And he said, if you think I'm an atheist, you ought to meet my wife. And I'm going, I don't want to meet your wife. I'll just deal with you. And so my evangelism with Carly is this discussion, this give and take. And then it talks about the marketplace, which in Greek is agora. It means the place where people go to be at rest. I think our drop-in centers are the agora. They are the place where kids can come and just kick back and relax, and we can engage them in conversations. It's harder for us now because the agora for so many of our kids involves a screen, and it's an agora out in cyberspace where they're hanging out. And how do we break through that, which is another whole issue. And then the last thing it says there, who happened to be there. It means who chanced to be there. Now, I've always been puzzled by that word, who happened to be there. And a long time ago when I was doing high school ministry in Orangeville, God explained this to me. I walk into the cafetorium, there's 900 kids, and on the far side of the cafetorium, so I'm coming in this way, 900 kids, and over in that far corner, there's a kid, his name's Harrison Beatty. He's waving his arms at me because I can't hear him, and he's going like this. And so we used to call it a run through, just visit as many kids as you can, and I'm halfway through the cafeteria now, and he comes and gets me, and he said, do you have a minute? I said, what's up? He said, well, we're having a discussion at my table about what happens when you die, and none of us have the answer. Like, do you have time to come and talk to us about it? I said, well, I think I can work this into my schedule. And so I go over, and there are the 9 kids who hate me with a passion, who call me Jesus freak, who would tear down my Campus Life meeting posters. I'd hang them up and go around the corner, and they would tear them down. If there were 9 kids in the school I did not want to talk to, these were the 9. And so I sat down, and I said, okay, Harrison, how can I help you? And he said, we're not sure what happens when we die. And I said, okay, let's do this. Let's start with you, and just tell me what you think happens when you die. So I closed my mouth, opened my ears, and I let everyone tell me what they thought happens when they die. And then it comes around to me. And what do they say? What do you think happens when you die? And I said, well, it's going to sound really weird, but and so I share my simple story of Jesus. Go directly to heaven, do not pass go, do not collect $200 like a Monopoly, just go right to heaven. And then I went back to each of them and did a little apologetic. And so for the girl who said, well, I think I'm going to heaven because, I'm good, I'm going, well, who decides if you're good? And then for the one, who said, I believe in God, I said, well, Adolf Hitler believed in God. He was a Presbyterian. Does that mean Adolf? So I did just a very gentle apologetic. So then the bell rang at the end of lunchtime, and everybody left except for our table. And then we went through another 45-minute class, and they all stayed. And then the bell rang again, but now it was the end of the school. And we're halfway through our discussion, and as soon as the bell rang, boom, they were gone. They didn't mind skipping class to be with me, but they weren't going to stay after school to be with me. So I get up, they're all gone. I'm walking out the door back here, and I said, God, what was that all about? And he said, who happened to be there? No. Divine appointments, right? You know those times when you walk around the school, you get in a conversation with a kid at your drop-in center or wherever, and it just kind of comes out of the blue? God is the master planner. There is no happen chance with God. God ordained in eternity past that you would engage the kids that you're engaging in your drop-in, wherever you're doing your ministry, who happen to be there. Albert Einstein said that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And that's why we need to be out in the marketplace. We need to be engaging in those conversations, because you never know when doors are going to open to real meaningful conversations with these kids. And you should be praying that God would give you those opportunities, that God will use you. The first group of kids I ever led to the Lord, I taught them just to ask God to use you, and he will use you. And I know you go, well, that's my job. Well, it is your job, but ask God to use you even more. Because I don't think God has a lot of Christians calling him up going, hey, I want to be used today, and if you don't use me, I'm going to be kind of ticked off about it. Nothing wrong with that. And so that just deepens our passion. The last thing on there is, how do we reach kids in a post-truth culture where personal preference has become their idol? So there's all kinds of idols. I've just taken one of their idols. It's personal preference. I prefer this over this. You prefer Jesus, I prefer this. And so personal preference. How do we reach them? Well, here's something else I learned from Rabbi. I try to give credit wherever I can. And because I've learned it, I'm just passing it on to you. Is that Rabbi says, don't ever talk about sin. And that, when he said that, I just, I go, what? How can we do that? He said, don't talk about sin because sin always gets us into trouble. He said, this is a statement he uses. We have lost the purpose for which we were created. Yes. So if you said that to a kid at your drop-in center, you're talking about this, well, I believe that we've lost the purpose for which we were created. They're going to say, and what do you think that is? And then the answer is, the purpose is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. No other worldview has you made in the image of God, and has that same God in the flesh dying on a cross to redeem you. Now that'll trigger some conversation. That'll open some doors. And this is where I come back to where we started. Friendship evangelism still works. It still requires us to build relationships, to engage in conversations. Screens and technology can't do that. And so when you're in your marketplace, bumping around with the kids and sharing with them the real reason why they're here and what their purpose is, friendship evangelism still works. It's never changed. We have these other fashions and fads. Most of us that come to the Lord, it's through friendship evangelism. Very few people come to into the kingdom through, the church or through big rallies. It's usually somebody took an interest in your life. All right, end of part one. Questions, comments? Anyone want to jump up and yell heresy at this point?
Did you have slides for difference between distress and offense that you didn't put up there?
No.
Okay.
But happy to send you my notes if you want them.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just important that Paul was never offended by the culture. It just seems we have a lot in the kingdom today who are offended by youth culture.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Anything else? All right. Let's ask questions as we go, because if we never get to the end of the notes, we will address what's important to you, and that's important to me. What are you doing here? You were in my class at Heritage, right? Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And you heard me there and you still showed up? Good for you. Good guy. I looked at you earlier and I go, yeah, that's the guy. All right. Let's do, I'm going to go for maybe 10 minutes and then we'll take a break. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Move. I just put new batteries in it. No, it disappeared. There we go. Technology's war strategy. So, I think Satan has used different methodologies to try and lead our generation of kids away. In the 60s and 70s, music became a god to a generation, and in the 70s into the 80s, Satan turned everything very dark. I think that was a strategy. Beginning in the 70s into the 80s, it was the breakdown of the family. And he tried to destroy the family. And then we've gone through, this loss of values and the loss of hope and all these kinds of things. My main concern is what's going on in cyberspace. When I'm out doing this part of the talk for parents, I always ask them this question, and I'll ask you the question, but we're not going to take time to discuss it. Is cyberspace a real place? Yes or no, and then give your evidence for it. Now, usually if I ask a group of parents that question, About 60 to 70% will say it is a real place, and then the rest aren't quite sure. So I'm going to simply suggest that cyberspace is a real place, and then build my foundation for why I believe it's a real place. And therefore, if it is a real place, we have some responsibilities as people of the kingdom to engage in it. A lot of people don't think that cyberspace is a real place, because when we go online, we're usually sitting in our own office or our own living room or wherever our computers might be. And what happens as soon as you go into cyberspace, everything changes, but you don't realize it's changing because you're still sitting in this form of reality. And what changes is your awareness and your emotions and your responses, and certainly your behaviors, things that you would look at and say and do online you would never do if somebody was standing in the room with you. And certainly our sense of time changes. And we have this thing called the time distortion effect, which simply says this, that you spend a lot more time in cyberspace than you think you do. And if you don't think that's true, next time you go online, cover up your little clock in the bottom right-hand corner and do whatever you're going to do, and just take a guess at how long you've been online. And most people, it's a lot longer. And we have this feeling that we get lost in cyberspace, which is exactly what we do. You know, you're out in cyberspace, you burn dinner, you forget to pick the kids up at school, you're late for an appointment. I can remember having my first lunch appointment a year ago with my pastor from Knox Presbyterian in Waterdown, which is around the corner here. And I'm sitting in the pub where we are meeting, and I sent him an email. It simply said this in the subject line: "Are you on email?" Because he loves email. And he goes, "I'll be right there." And he said, "I was out in cyberspace. I was doing email," and that kind of thing. And so we get caught up in it. It changes our behavior. But our minds tell us that we haven't gone anyplace. We haven't really entered a new environment, but we have. And the rules that we have learned for life in this reality do not apply in cyberspace. And that's the danger, because the conditions and qualities in cyberspace are very much different than how we live here. Now here's my evidence that cyberspace is a real place, and the rules and the boundaries that we have in this life, it's a perfect example why it doesn't work out there. 2 years ago, Kilgore High School in Texas is a high school, rural high school of 800 kids. Over 200 of them were caught sexting each other within the school. So there were 200 kids that they could identify had nude and semi-nude pictures on their phone. It was all being circulated within their school population. And I'm guessing that if they got a hold of everybody's phone, it was much higher than 200. Now, think of it this way. Would those same 200 kids who got caught print off 3.5 by 5 inch glossy pictures of their breasts and their genitalia and their ripped abs and all that? Would they print off like 500 of them and then go to the school the next day and just randomly go, "Hey, here's a picture of my breasts. Here, you need one." Yeah. And you go, "Well, that's absurd." Well, it is absurd. Because in this reality, you were taught boundaries and ethics that said you would never do that. Well, then why, when they go out in cyberspace, do they do it? It's because we are not equipped as people of God to live in that virtual reality. And it brings with it a lot of problems. As a society, we have done a great job of protecting our children from all kinds of things, and yet we've done a lousy job when it comes to protecting kids when they go out into cyberspace, because most parents have no idea what their kids are doing out there. But cyberspace has some pretty dangerous places and some dangerous neighborhoods. And I can't think of a single app that is danger-free. They can all be infiltrated by perverts and advertising companies. I mean, everybody knows what's going on out there. So there is no safe place out there. I'm speaking in Cobourg, Ontario on Monday night, and they've got 10 of these Disney Circle, to protect your kids. Well, that's not going to protect your kids. So we have this place called cyberspace, and our kids are spending a lot of time on it. I was laughing when I was in Tennessee. I got on the elevator. There's a guy standing in the corner with a screen like this, and I get on the elevator. We go down 2 floors, And he just turns like a robot and walks out the door. I don't even know if he knew I was on the elevator. And walks down through to get breakfast and this kind of thing. And so our kids are spending time. We know that they are addicted in a lot of cases, and I'll talk about this after break. But here's my question for you. Knowing that cyberspace is a real place that is filled with dangers, and that so many of our kids are either addicted to it or they have addictive behaviors, are we part of the problem when we allow them to bring them on retreats, to bring them to youth group, to use them in church, to constantly have them on it? And this will become a little bit clearer when I build the case for pervasive technology and how they are designed to addict and what happens to our kids. So I think in youth ministry, one of our responsibilities is to teach proper technology use and how to have a healthy tech life. Now I get parents who ask me, at what age do you think my kids should have a screen? And I'm going 16 and over. And I think that will become a little bit clearer after we have our break and we talk about how these things are strictly designed to addict. Some of you sitting in this room have addictive behaviors. Now let's just be honest. Have any of you had that phantom vibration sensation since we came in here? Yeah, no. But you've had it. How many of you had the phantom vibration? That's a sign that you have an addictive behavior. That's what it's like, and I'll explain more of that afterwards. So, all right. 10:45, that's when Brett told me I had to stop for break. How long do we have? All right, everybody's fueled up. All right. For those of you who are ready, I am going to begin. For the rest of you who still want to talk, just keep talking, but talk quietly. So the people who paid real money to be here will get what they want. So. All right, just a reminder that if you want a copy of my notes, I can send it. And usually what I do is I throw in a few of the support articles, like Technology's War on Children and some of these other ones. So if you're a reader, I'll bundle up a little Word file and send all that stuff out to you. So, all right, I spend most of my time speaking to parents and a bunch of stuff with youth workers as well. And if I had a nickel for every time I heard a heartbreaking story from a parent, well, I couldn't retire, but it's significant. And I was in Tilsonburg not long ago, and this father came up to me at break when no one was around, and with a tear in his eye, he began to tell me the story of how addicted his 15-year-old son is to technology and online gaming, and how he's tried everything possible to get him to spend less time on videos and gaming and all this kind of stuff. And there's a part inside of me that just breaks because I understand how persuasive technology has addicted not only his kid, but most kids today. And I simply, yep.
Did you ask him what he tried?
Yep. And here's the answer. Not much of what you can try is going to work. And here's why. Technology has done a great job of addicting kids to screens. Now, when I speak to parents, I say to them, here's a marker for you. If you tell your kids to get off their smartphones or off their iPads, do they go ballistic? And 99.9% of the parents say, yeah, they're rude, they yell, they scream, they say their life won't go on and this kind of thing. And I said, I said, like a heroin addict who can't get their next fix? And they go, yeah, exactly. But you see, this is an addiction. And the brain can be addicted to anything, and the brain responds the same way to any kind of an addiction. In other words, you can take a porn addiction, a heroin addiction, a cigarette addiction, an online gaming addiction, and when you do magnetic imaging of their brains and what happens when they're engaged in their addictive behavior, the brain is the same. The brain does not distinguish between right and wrong. The brain just knows what gives it a kick of dopamine, and that's what it likes to engage in. And so parents who are up against this stuff, I'm going, you are in the battle of your life because they have done it so well when it comes to mixing psychology and technology. Psychology is that field of study that understands human behavior and is really designed to make us more healthy people, right? Not for people in technology. They have taken how the brain works, studied how to manipulate it, and mix it with technology and give us apps and phones and programs that will only nurture that kind of addiction. And so here's my definition for persuasive technology. It's a discipline in which digital machines and apps such as smartphones, social media, and gaming are configured to alter human thoughts and behaviors. And this is what is happening. They alter behaviors. They alter how we think, but they do it so well as that we don't realize it. So when a child is getting addicted to a screen, they don't realize what is happening, but the makers of the technology understand the role, especially of dopamine and intermittent and classical conditioning, and I'll expand a little bit more on those. And so what we now have them doing is creating all kinds of games and apps and stimuli to keep kids on screens as long as possible. And these are machines now, meaning the screens, that have the ability to change how we act and what we do and how we think. My wife is always amazed where online, if she's been to a certain clothing store and looking at stuff, and then every time she goes to a web page, there's ads for that store popping up. And I'm going, that's how they track you, right? And they do that with our kids, and advertisers track them. And so what happens is they're creating digital environments that users feel their basic human drives, fulfill their basic human drives better than real world alternatives. Now, of a 3-hour thing on smartphone technology, this is the one piece I want to give you, because to me it's the life-changing part and explains what is happening. And so what happens is you have kids basically who are trying to have all their human needs fulfilled in cyberspace rather than in real life. Let's begin with the girls. A girl's basic drive is to be socially acceptable, to have as many friends and as many conversations as they possibly can. And the kiss of death for any girl on social media is to be rejected. So that is what drives them. This is what psychology has proven, and this is what technology then plays into. They are trying to grow up into full womanhood by living their life in cyberspace. And so social media companies use persuasive design to prey on their desire of teens and preteens to be socially connected. That's the psychology. That is a healthy form when it's used in proper ways, such as living life in the real world. To be socially acceptable and to have friends is built into our DNA. We as Christians were built to live in community. And so marketers come along and tech companies come along, and this is what they will use to addict girls to their screens. Now, they are conditioned by getting as many likes or thumbs up as you possibly can, retweets, reposts, great selfies, and long threads on Snapchat. All of those are the rewards for staying online and becoming socially acceptable. We have this thing called the 100 Likes Club. I was in Columbia, South Carolina 2 years ago, and this girl came up to me after, she sat in on the parent seminar, and said, Paul, my school is the 100 Likes Club. And it's basically if you don't get 100 likes for whatever you're posting, you're a loser. I heard a girl at Rona in Oakville, I was in getting some paint supplies the other day, and this girl who works there, say early 20s, she's telling the other guys that she's working with, well, you know, when I get up in the morning, I really don't check my social media posts because I'm afraid of what I might see. And maybe I'm not as popular, as beautiful as I think I might be, so I don't check it in the morning, and then I come in here to work, and like right now, all I'm thinking about is what responses have I got? And so she said, I can usually resist till about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I pull out my smartphone and I check what's going on. Why? Because she's been addicted to it. She's been conditioned that she can't live without it. And I think it's a very sad way to live your life as a young girl, letting other people, most of whom you don't even know who they are, have input into your life. It's the creation of what they call the cyber self. We have self-image, self-worth, self-esteem, and for this generation of kids you're working with, it's the cyber self. It's the self you create and post out there in virtual reality. But here's the problem. Your cyber self works 24/7. When a 15-year-old girl posts something before she goes to bed and she is sleeping, it is hard at work because people are looking in and either giving it thumbs up or thumbs down or giving her some sort of media feedback. The cyber self never sleeps, it never rests. But it will determine what kind of a day she will have when she wakes up in the morning and checks to see how the cyber self did overnight. Simply sad as far as I'm concerned. And yet, because they have used persuasive technology to hook them into this stuff, they really don't stand a chance. And this is why, people ask me, parents ask me, how old should my kids be before they get a screen? I'm saying 16. And if you can delay that to 18, that's even better. Because the problem with all of the kids that we work with, they have undeveloped brains. The human brain isn't fully developed until you're 25 years old. These kids, and this is where I get angry, these kids don't stand a chance once they look at a screen. Because the most addictive chemical in the world is nicotine. It's not heroin, it's not, fentanyl or anything. It's nicotine. A cigarette manufacturer can addict a person for a lifetime with one drag on a cigarette. I look at screens and kids watching them and go, it's the same thing. Because what happens is they are immediately sent some sort of a notification to respond to, and that's where the addiction begins. What happens with the guys? The guy's basic drive is to achieve and to have competency, i.e. online gaming. There are many more boys who are addicted to online gaming than there are girls. Girls tend to be more in the social media realm, boys tend to be the online gaming. And so when this father comes to me with a tear in his eye and talks about, he can't get his kids off of this, I understand why. It's because they have been designed to addict kids and addict them quickly. And so what happens is that video games becomes the greatest source of rewards and recognition for our young boys. They are continually fed rewards and extra points and extra weapons and all these kinds of things. All of that is designed to keep them playing and keep them on the screen. Yep.
I just had one of my youth tell me that he logged over 700 hours on Rainbow Six in less than a month.
Yeah. And would his parents know about that?
I don't know, but he was proud of the fact that he was platinum 1 year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he was that's all he could talk about. And I said, well, what else do you do? And he's like, nothing.
Yeah.
So, hang out with friends, and he said, my friends are on there.
Yeah. And so even though he lost $700,
No, 700 hours.
700 hours on it. Yeah.
Like a span of a month or so.
Yeah. And so that's a badge of honor for a guy.
It's huge. He
Yeah.
said he was recognized nationally.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's only 20 hours a whole month that you don't, that you're not on it.
Yeah.
So less than an hour a day you're not on it.
What they're saying is that 2 or more kids who spend 2 or more hours per day online tend to be much more unhappy than kids who aren't using it. So, and I don't have time to go into a lot of the trending stuff. If you want stuff on trending in social media and some of the stuff, I can send that stuff to you as well. Brett.
I'm just wondering, and if you're getting to this, you can just like.
Okay.
But in your own perspective or your own like ideal, I'm wondering what would your own ideal be for like a 16-year-old to use technology? Would it be like no phone, no social media at all, or is there like a medium in between that you're?
If I had a 16-year-old, I would say no. I would say no screens. I met a father at Moore's clothing store the day before I had to go to a wedding My wife said, you don't have anything to wear, so I went out and bought a suit the day before. Typical man thing, right? But the guy that was waiting on me had a 14-year-old daughter who doesn't have a phone. And I said, good for you, because he's smart. He knows what's going on out there because he's an avid reader. Because it is so highly addictive, if I had a 16-year-old, my standard, and I would work my hardest to do it, would be 18. Because you're playing with fire. And this is, you see, and parents and youth workers who don't believe this have bought into the marketer's worldview that all of this is good and healthy. And it's not. On the bibliography, the book Wired Child, which I just finished reading, is probably the most powerful look at what is happening and how do we counter it. So my greatest fear is my 6 grandkids. When they come to my house, there's no screens. You know, Grandma Robertson is an elementary school teacher. Everything ends up being a school lesson, right? But they love it. She's doing science experiments. We're out in the backyard doing things together and this kind of thing. At the cottage, absolutely no screens. And I say that because I spend a lot of time studying what's happening, and it scares me. And so for my grandchildren, and I send articles to my kids to say, hey, you need to be aware of this when it comes to your kids. So, good question. Yep.
How do you recommend to handle? Because when they are 14 or 7 or 15, the pressure of the friends
Yep.
and all what is around them is so strong.
Yeah.
And sometimes, because I've heard this from some parents of my church, that they feel that like they are like battling alone against all that pressure. That is very, very strong, and the kids really fight to have some this
Yeah.
gadgets.
Well, the kids fight for it because they have been influenced through persuasive technology that life won't go on without this. And parents have to decide, am I going to do the right thing or not do the right thing? And so this is what I tell parents when I'm doing a parenting seminar. And I have somebody was asking me earlier, I don't charge to do seminars right now because I have a lady that's underwriting all my speaking ministry. And so I say to the parents, you got to decide, are you going to do the right thing or are you just going to let this go on? And here's where you're headed. You already see the addictive behaviors in your kids and you're not willing to do anything about it. And when I speak in Coburg on Monday night, I had an email last night from Tony, and I said the parents who need to be at this thing are parents who have kids from 0 to 10, because that's where all of this stuff is taking place. And what I will say is, here's the evidence. It's not healthy for your kids to be on screen. The only screen that looks like it's all right is educational screen time, where they are learning, and it doesn't seem to have that addictive quality to it. Yeah, I just become the grumpy old man on this topic, so it's just here and then here. Yep.
So, I guess this is just like a challenge more than a question.
Yeah.
But if screens, like for me, I see screens as like part of their culture.
Yeah.
And so, I guess like a perspective would be like, if Jesus was part of his culture, right? And do you think like it would maybe be more helpful to teach them how to have a healthy relationship rather than just pull them out of the culture altogether? Like teaching them from, like I'm not saying to have a screen when you're 10, but when they're 14, to teach them how to have a healthy relationship with the screen and with their social media and how to interact with it positively with their friends, rather than completely removing them from that and then almost like, do you know what I'm trying to get at here?
Yep.
So what do you think of that?
Well, I think then pornography is part of their culture. We should just let them see the porn, and I mean, it's like, where are you going to draw the line on this stuff? And I understand what you're saying, but if it's not healthy for them, why would we permit it? And here's, Brett and I were speaking in November to a group of mainly CRC youth pastors, and I asked 80 of them, how many of you are doing anything in your youth ministry to help your kids develop healthy tech and screen habits? You know how many out of 80 were doing anything? 0. And then I ended up speaking to a group of parents coming out of that, because one of the girls said, I want you to come and speak to my parents, and, you know, at their church and this kind of thing. I'm just, it is so fraught with dangers that we don't understand. And so when people say to me, well, there's nothing wrong with it, or what about a little bit? I'm going, you have bought into the marketer's advertising and the marketer's rationale as to why this is good. Marketers who say, you know, having your 6-year-old on a screen is a healthy thing for them, they have no scientific evidence of it. So much of their promotional material is anecdotal and it's not based on science. So how do we respond as youth workers then? I think one role that we can play, given that we're in the battle, is how to control your screen time. You know, someone who will hold you accountable. And so, yeah, we have a role to play in it. Because if they're going to be using it, then how do we come alongside and help them to use it wisely and in a healthy way? You don't buy that, but that's my answer.
I could go there, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to.
That's all right. You can email me. Yeah, yeah. I'm just going, we have a responsibility to help our kids with this issue because it's a significant issue. The same way we would with loneliness, anxiety, porn addiction, or any other kind of issue that they're into. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
We are trying to tackle this thing also
Yep.
because it's impacting our kids and youth and everything really fast, really bad. And last year we did a camp with a team of, are you a player or a watcher? And so we shared, so you touched, your answer to this was mostly how to control it, and your way was to put our minds and thinking on, okay, how can we control pornography? But we can educate, and we can help them, because they will do it whatever we do. If we take their phone, they will find a way to do it.
Yeah.
So there's no stopping it.
Right.
Technology is just evolving. If we keep them in shell, bad for them and bad for Christianity, in a way that we will be outcasts. I understand and totally agree, but I also see that there is a way for us to move forward and teach them healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that we did it, tried to do it,
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
through this team camp.
Yeah. Oh, good for you. Yeah.
And we just thought we're teaching them how to become those who are content creators and encourage their peers and young people around them through social media, not to be the ones who are sucking in with the world,
Yeah.
seeing all the bad information and getting fed up with lies.
Yeah, and bringing balance. See, I'm not against technology. I mean, you know, I'm going back and forth on speaking engagements on the break. So I'm not against technology, but I'm against it when technology rules our lives, and that's what happens with our kids. So how do we bring some balance back to them? You know, I had a 15-year-old girl in Brockville come up to me at break on a seminar called Smart Parenting for a Smartphone Generation, come up to me and say, everything you said is true. Could you come and speak to my high school? Because she said, we don't understand this stuff. And so there's that educational part to helping our kids to come to terms with this stuff. And so we have a role to play to bring truth. So, you know, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose it for what it is. I'm simply exposing technology for the addictive thing that it is. And I've said to Christians, if Christians in Canada would tie 10% of their screen time to the building of the kingdom, we'd have a revolution going on. Because some of the Christians were just as bad with this stuff. And so, you know, again, somewhere there's some balance, especially when you're an older teen and a young adult. But they're showing anybody more than 2 hours a day, their life is running into problems. So, Britt, did you have another question?
No.
Of course, you had no questions on theology, but then we come to technology and you're all over this. Yeah. Go.
No, I think you kind of answered it.
Okay. I'm happy to answer any of your questions by email. I live on email. All right, so I know. for business purposes. Yeah, yeah. Twitter's too short. Yeah.
So, yeah, as a youth director, I think it's really valid what you said that a lot of us don't talk on technology. I probably agree with you on that for sure. I think it's one of those things that we don't spend enough time on. If you want to answer this now or you want to answer it after, it's totally different.
Okay.
But how do you do like a series or something like that on talking about technology? Because I feel like it's a lot to talk about in like a half an hour span or whatever. So like, what would your suggestions be to that? Like,
Well, part of the problem, we in youth ministry haven't really tackled this issue. I had a high school group ask me to come and speak, a youth group of 35 high school kids. And what I did was I took the 7 current trends that has come out of the latest research by Gene Twenge in a book called iGen. And I bounced each one of them off. I made it kind of a continuum kind of thing. And so, you know, like kids who spend 2 or more hours per day on technology tend to be much more unhappy than kids who don't. True or false? Why do you think that is? And so I'm kind of doing education as we're talking kind of thing. And any of the kids who have sat in on my seminars for their parents come up and go, we had no idea. You know, and so I'm just trying to, how do we educate our kids? How do we help them be a little bit smarter? How do we help them deal with the peer pressure? I have parents who come to me who say, my kids don't have phones, and I'm getting peer pressure from the other mothers in the group because I'm the only mother who won't let their daughter have a phone. And I'm just going, just tell them you're not called to raise all of their kids. You're called to raise your daughter, and how you raise your daughter is between you and the Lord. So I get parents who feel the pressure when they try and curb some of this stuff.
He'll send it to you for free.
iGen, it's on the, yeah. Paula, I don't want you using anonymous email names to get more votes out of it. One more question and then we need to keep rolling here. Yeah. Yeah.
And the problem is, like, when it comes to online applications, things like that, I'm lost. We had to do a story tap thing where we had to send in our testimony. I was the only guy where James Clifford was like, everyone else is wrong with you. He's like, everyone else is having this no problem. He's like, everything that can go wrong will go wrong with you.
Yeah.
And so, how do we have the best intentions? And I mean, my parents have the best intentions, but I'm lost when it comes down to technology.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how do you have a balance like that of trying to communicate and educate, but you're not sabotaging them quite a bit for society as their life, all of society?
Well, I think one of the role of a school is to teach kids how to use technology. But when I see schools that give every kid in the class an iPad where they can access stuff that they shouldn't be accessing, then I go, you know, we've got a problem there as well. And so I think, you know, we need to teach our kids how to use the technology, but be very, very careful. So using technology for educational purposes versus online gaming and social media is 2 totally different things. And so how do you, and I go 20 and over, you're on your own. My concern are kids 0 to 10 is my major concern right now, because that's where so much of this addictiveness begins. If I had been you, I would have handwritten my testimony out and mailed it to James Clifford. But let me just say this. You're, but you see, but then we begin to think that we are something lesser in the community and in society when we don't have those skills. And I go, that's a lie spawned in the pits of hell.
Well, it's not that I feel lesser, it's just that I really, there's so many things that I do not know how to do. It's not that I feel lesser, it's just, I'm not completely out of touch with it.
We'll just have to send you to Andre Retta in St. Thomas, who's pretty socially technology in that, right? Yeah. And yet he has a good ministry going on, life goes on. So, all right, let me just get back on track here so we can at least hit on some of this. So So boys, it's about getting rewards and this kind of thing, and that's what does it. And so you see what happens is every time you get a like or you get extra points when you're playing a game, your brain gives you a shot of dopamine, and that's where the addictiveness takes place. Even the fact that you will seek out to go play games or you will seek out to get your social media feedback is determined by the dopamine that is developed and sent into your brain. That's where all the addiction takes place. And people don't understand that. Even people who do online gambling and lose money, they still get addicted to losing because they still get that kick out of getting it wrong and not doing it. And the sign of any addictive behavior is this, that you will continue on in the behavior even though you know it's destructive. So an alcoholic will keep drinking even though he's lost his job and destroyed his family, he will keep on drinking. Kids will do the same thing. Kids will, their destructive behavior is I go to my room when I come home from school and I don't come out for dinner. I cut myself off from other people socially and so forth and so on. Those are all signs of addictive behaviors. And we do it even though, we don't do our homework because we'd rather be online. Those are all addictive behaviors. When you do things that harm you for the sake of doing this thing that you've been conditioned to do, that's where the problem is. All right, now let me just put the bottom on this slide and we can move on here. Come on, move. All right, ought to be that way. So what happens is to live your life and grow your life and do all this identity formation online is fun, it's exciting, and it's easy to do because a few clicks here, a few clicks there, you can be happy and successful. Versus reality, which is where you should be living your life, can be scary and challenging and hard work. This is why kids don't like to answer phone calls because they have to have an immediate response to it. And they don't like to carry on conversations because they're much more comfortable doing stuff with their thumbs. You see, if you had the choice between the two and you're a 15-year-old, you're going to go with cyberspace because it's fun, exciting, and stimulating. This is why school has become so boring for so many kids. Because compared to cyberspace, there is no comparison. So for some of us in this room, or most of us in this room, for me, my life was lived in a reality which included a baseball coach that corrected your behavior, hockey coaches who corrected your behavior, school teachers who actually had the right to send you to the office. I grew up in a public school where if you looked at the teacher the wrong way, you got the strap from the principal. And there were clearly set boundaries and realities of people having input in my life. I started to work at the grocery store when I was 11, so I learned responsibility and time management, all these things. And so we learn to live life at its best in this reality. And so for you in youth ministry, the more you can do that doesn't involve screens with your kids and keep them in this reality, the better off they will be. But right now, it's too easy for kids to go into cyberspace and think that they can form an identity that will be healthy and work in the real life. It doesn't work once they get out of college or university and you go out into the real world. It all begins to fall apart, and by then, a lot of them are addicted to these things anyway. 3 quick ways on how they change behaviors of our kids online. Motivation. Well, we've already talked about the key motivation for girls is to be socially acceptable and never to be rejected or humiliated. So one is fear-driven, one is driven by the desire to be more acceptable. And for guys, it's the idea that I can develop a competency by playing games, which gives me continual rewards and feedback. And who thinks, builds this idea in me that I am really accomplishing something. That's the motivator. The ability, 0. All you got to do is touch your keypad. It doesn't take any skills. Now, some of you argue, well, I play online again. I understand that. But think about how simple it is. I just pull it up and I start to touch my keypad or touch the screen or whatever. And then the thing that really locks them in are the triggers. And the triggers are the notifications. Better check your social media. You hear the bells and the whistles and the vibrations and all this kind of stuff. And that's what they do.
Could I add something?
Yep.
About ability?
Yep.
Today, gaming industry is starting to overgrow porn industry.
Yep.
And ability to be good in gaming is a thing that is very remarkable, because there are so many people who are very good at it, and people make $1 million plus US dollars monthly for playing online.
Yeah.
So that is why it is becoming, I could even say, a job for many people. And I think that, yeah, I totally agree, but this is the part where it's hard for me to understand and to fully agree, because I see the way where it's going. And it is not only sitting and touching keyboard or so it, now it is becoming more serious. And people are investing a lot of time, and there are huge companies who invest a lot of money into players in each country in the world. So they're a huge industry that is not very simple to.
Yeah, and every kid who plays games, that's his goal, is to become like one of those people. That's the imitation.
Video games have become esports, so-called esports. So there are competitions that some of them are even allowed to play in the Olympics.
But you see, a 13-year-old undeveloped brain says, I can be just like them. They don't take into what they're going to miss in life by getting to that level, and that's part of the sadness about the whole thing. All right? I can only give you a hockey stat in Canada. In Canada, 1 out of 186,000 young male hockey players will make it to the NHL. 1 out of 186,000, and their average stay in the NHL will be less than a year. All these kids that are looking on online gamers, that, you know, the odds of ever getting to that level are pretty remote, but the manufacturers of this stuff don't care as long as you're playing and feeding information to the advertisers and padding the coffers of the companies that run these things.
But could you say that it is the same thing with any business and any work today?
No.
This is.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time establishing the difference. Like you're saying, okay, so my dad, he was a drywaller, and he learned the skill of drywalling, and then he went and made money.
Yeah.
Kids are just doing things these days, which is every bit as real to them and to our culture, but they're making more money. And lots more people are making more money. So what I'm failing to see is the difference when it says reality and then cyberspace. And in fact, reality is cyberspace to a huge portion of this world's population. And I'm just failing to see how
So because your dad didn't have notifications and red buttons to push.
Right, but that means nothing because he's dead and gone, and now I have all these kids that have no, they either have no hope or they have hope, and their world is lived in cyberspace.
And I'm just going, we need to be smart about how we're going to help them get through it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Bonnie.
Well, what I'm hearing what Kiki is saying is because when they make this to a business as a sense of achievement, I think the motivation is no longer pleasure, right? Because if every single kid treats this as a job, I feel there will be fewer kids on social media, right? If I keep on pushing my kid and say, you gotta get like 1 million likes on there, they will no longer like social media.
That's what happened to you,
Because it's almost the same as like in a Chinese culture, I force my kids to like practice piano for 10 hours. I force them to drill math for like 100 hours. Right? They will start doing it. But with social media, it's just that there's no parental control. There's no adult involved in there. And so once you start going into it, you're like, hey, I'm involved in your life too, right here.
All right, let me say this, and then we're going to keep on moving. I'm going to stay for lunch. Because that's all I get for doing this is a free lunch from Brett Andrews. I brought my credit card. See, when you ask most young boys today, what do you want to be when you grow up? Most of them are saying, we want to be game programmers, or we want to create great. And here's why that happens. When I was growing up, kids wanted to be firefighters or policemen because that was the models they had in their culture. You will want to grow up to be what it is that you are doing through your teen years. What you do is what you will become. And that's why the vast majority of young boys want to have a life in the world of technology and this kind of thing. But it's pretty unrealistic for a lot of them, all right?
What is that?
End of discussion on that one. You're starting to make me angry now. Nothing worse than a balding 66-year-old angry man at the podium. All right. I'm just watching because I got some important stuff on porn and genders and this kind of stuff I want. Now, very quickly, designed to addict. The two ways that it addicts, number one is that it just feels good to hold these things in our hands. I mean, I'm amazed at how many people you see walking and for no reason, they're just carrying these things in their hands. It is designed, so if you look at the curve, this is an iPhone 6, and you look at the curve and you look at do you know how many hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to decide that that's how that angle should be and how that thickness should be? It was designed so that when you hold it in your hand, it feels good. And we all like to hold these things for some reason. That's part of the addiction. It becomes an extension of who I am. It becomes a fashion statement because you can get all these fancy covers to put on them and that kind of thing. But the main way this addicts, and I'll just cut the 1 point out of a number here, is it's called classical conditioning. These things addict you and especially our young people through classical conditioning. It means that your notifications are going to go off not at regular time. If every 60 seconds your phone notification, whatever one it might be, went off, within about 15 minutes you would ignore it. Why? Because you know it's coming. And we tend to ignore the regular. Intermittent classical condition is you never know when it's going to go off. You never know whether it's going to be a text or a tweet or an email or a phone call. You can set them up different tones and vibrations. And they also have a little red button for things that you need to respond to. When they first designed this, those were blue buttons. And what they discovered was people ignore blue buttons, but people cannot resist a red button. It's a psychological thing. Red means it needs to have action taken on it. And so intermittent conditioning, classical conditioning, is used to addict kids to these things. And that's why they're always checking it. Every time they check it, regardless of what is on the screen, they get a shot of dopamine. There are people who will touch their phones over 2,000 times a day. When I asked this high school group not far from here in Smithville, you know, how many times a day are you checking your phone? Now, these are all Christian kids from a Christian high school, and the numbers were very low, but I said to them, you know, you're atypical. You're not the norm. But even then, we're saying some of them were checking their phones 100 times a day. In Canada, the average teenager will check their phone somewhere between 150 and 200 times a day, and I think that's low. And I simply say this, even for us as adults, if we check our phones 100 times a day, and even if that averages out to 30 seconds, which is probably low, because we're going to reply to it, because dopamine kicks in, we will have to, you know, that's 50 minutes out of our day that we have lost. That's 350 minutes a week. That's time that we in the kingdom will never get back. So be careful about how much time you're spending with these things. And where better could your kingdom or your time be spent? I discovered quite by accident the do not disturb button on my phone. It was a blessing from God. I spent 3 days cursing my phone because stuff was coming in. There was no buzzes, there were no bells going, there was nothing. And I'd go and there'd be stuff on there and go, like, my phone is broken, I need to go back to Rogers and tell them what. And then I discovered that little crescent moon was lit up, and it's the do not disturb, where stuff comes in but you don't know it. It's been a blessing to my life. I leave my phone on do not disturb. And this is the reason why. I want to be in control of it. I don't want it to be in control of my life. And that's why I live by the do not disturb button. So anyway, be that as it may. All right, last part. Where are the battlegrounds? I've given you two, and I'm not going to say much about the first one. So battleground porn, as I call it. So, you know, I did a 3-hour seminar in down south of Belleville a couple weeks ago with a church on this whole thing. Let me just summarize battleground porn and say this: that sexuality has become a thing to be enjoyed rather than a commitment or the reward from having a lifelong commitment. So sex is an end in itself. Pleasure, has become the highest virtue. In a marriage bond, as God has set it up, sexual experience and sexual pleasure is a result of a commitment to another person. A marriage between a man and a woman. And so sexual pleasure is the reward for that kind of a commitment. In the culture of your kids, City Line in Toronto did a show last week, my wife taped it, where they had about 10 high school kids from Toronto answering questions about sex, and what's going on, just was unbelievable. And so, sex has become an end in itself. Pornography is simply a visual addiction. Most pimps were porn addicts. It's a visual addiction that happens. Battleground lifestyles is the whole thing that comes with the LGBTQ+++. And here's the only thing I would say about that, is the thing that bothers me most about that is when you venture outside, he made them male and he made them female, and when you take any variation of that, what you're saying is the Creator made a mistake. You deny what God has put into place. And I think that's what makes God sad. That he made them male and he made them female. And now you have any number, I have a list of 60 different variations that you can claim to be. And trust me, that complicates your ministry. I understand that. You're on the front lines trying to deal with this stuff. And so we come at it with a biblical worldview which says any sex outside of marriage is wrong, whether it's a gay relationship or transgender relationship. Anything outside of this little boundary is wrong. And we have to stick to that because that brings hope, that it is possible to live your life within those kind of boundaries and still be fully human and fully blessed by God. And so I think in my study, and we've just done a whole study paper at Toronto Youth for Christ, and we're still working through it. We've been on it, what now? Over 2 years, I think. Trying to have a good, solid biblical response to the community. And so we need to know what we stand for. And at the back of your handout, the handout that I just gave you goes with 3.2. All right? So that is the best thing I've read by Ravi Zacharias, who after the Supreme Court in Canada in 2015, or Supreme Court in America in 2015 declared that homosexual relationships were legit all across America, Ravi Zacharias was asked to write a response paper to it. It's very thoughtful, it's very compassionate, it's very Christian, and I think there's things that we can learn that we can apply in our youth ministries out of those 2 articles, plus his one on God's plan for marriage. So I like it because it's a loving response. And Ravi says, if we don't respond with love, we've lost the battle. And so much of it is about anger and hearing my voice above everybody else's voice, and I'm right and you're wrong, and this kind of thing. And so that's the takeaway. The next page, 4.0, how do we respond as youth ministry workers? This comes from my friend Walt Mueller at the Center for Parent Youth Understanding down in Pennsylvania that I work with. And there's just some practical responses that we can implement as youth workers when it comes to the porn issue or any of these issues. And it all comes back to how do we teach a healthy sexuality to our kids. And I think there's a lot of kids who are so messed up with what's going on in terms of porn and the whole lifestyles thing, that the good news for them is that there is hope. There is a way to live your life in such a way that you feel fulfilled. And again, it's one of those topics. I've got a few articles if you want more articles on these things that I think are thoughtful. I start my day when my browser opens up. I'm at our website out of Pennsylvania. It's cpyu.org, Center for Parent Youth Understanding.org, and it has a culture news right in the middle of the front page. That's where I start every day. Plus, there's tons of resources. So if I think it's on the bottom of the bibliography page at the back as well. Let me just say one more thing about the problem with sexual immorality, and just to kind of draw a line where you can build from, and then we'll be out of time. I was asked a few years ago to speak at a camp, Mishawa, and I did it for 2 years, and then I handed it off to Brett. And how many summers did you do Mishawa? 2? Anyway, my first year there, they asked me, in addition to doing the evening sessions with 125 high school kids plus the staff, would I do a workshop on sexuality? And so I said, sure. So the Monday morning, I said, just tell them to bring their Bibles and pens and papers, and we'll do 2 workshops. So the first one, I walk in, and it's kind of a barn. It's a really cool place, and there's benches for the kids to sit on. And I said to them, I said, okay, everybody's got your Bible and your pens, and I said, okay, girls, here's what I want you to do. Girls, I want you to find all the verses in the Bible that says you shouldn't put your hand in a boy's pants. So what do the girls do? They open their Bibles, and they're starting like, what are the boys doing? They have fallen off their chairs laughing because I have said that in public. And I said, okay, guys, dust yourselves off, get back on your benches. Guys, I want you to find all the verses in the Bible that says you shouldn't put your hand on a girl's breasts. What do the boys do? They fall off the chairs laughing again, this kind of thing. Eventually they settle down, so I give them 15 or 20 minutes, and there's just light discussion. They're writing this and that. And then I stop and I say, girls, what did you find about putting your hand in a boy's pants? And they said, well, we didn't find anything that specific. I said, but you've been writing. What did you find? And they said, well, we found all these verses on sexual immorality. And they read a couple. I said, okay, hold on to that. And I said, guys, what did you find about putting your hand on a girl's breast? And they, well, nothing that specific. But we found some verses on sexual immorality as well. And so in the New Testament, Acts 15 says to abstain from it. Romans 13 says don't be involved in it. 1 Corinthians 6 says that we're not meant from it, we should flee from it. 1 Corinthians 10 says do not commit it. Ephesians 5 says let there not be a hint of it in your life. And Colossians 3 says put it to death. And 1 Thessalonians 4 says that we're avoid it. And so and then I asked them a very simple question. What is sexual immorality? Because it sure seems like it's a pretty important thing to God, and we should avoid it, put it to death. So what is sexual immorality? So I asked these 125 high school kids, plus the youth pastors, were you there that day? No, it's Susie's camp. But anyway, I wait, and no one has an answer. And I'll bet that if I waited, you couldn't give me an answer either. So here's my definition of sexual immorality, which I got from a very wise Fellowship Baptist minister when I had to give the big sex talk to my 4 boys, because my wife said if they were girls, I'd be giving the talk. Their boys are all yours. And so knowing this was in the back of mind, I called Don Fitchett. And here's my working definition. I think I left you a line because it's the most important thing in your handout. Sexual immorality is anything you do or say which causes a chemical, emotional, physical change in you, causing you to want to go further sexually, and which you know eventually will lead to sexual intercourse. Anything you do or say which causes a chemical, emotional, physical change in you, causing you to want to go further sexually, and which you know eventually leads to sexual intercourse. So I read that to the 125 kids, and this boy at the back says, well, if that's true, sir, there sure isn't much you can do. I'm going bingo. Keep it for marriage. Now, I think, and this is why I've given it to youth, and I've asked that question for years at Tyndale Seminary where I've taught, Tyndale College where I've taught, and Emmanuel where Brett and I teach, and no one's ever have an answer. I'm just going, at least that's a point to start to have a discussion about what is healthy Christian sexuality. Because I was at a high school, King's Collegiate in Oakville, in November, and I gave them this definition because none of them knew. And then what I did with the Christian kids there was I tried to build and show the difference between a secular worldview of sexuality and a biblical worldview of sexuality. I gave them my definition for biblical sexual immorality. What's the secular definition of sexual immorality? Do whatever you want with as many people possible, whatever variation. There is that. And then I had them go, what are the pros and cons of each of those worldviews? And so what happens is I was just trying for them to visually see that there are a lot of pros about remaining abstinent or sexually pure till marriage versus getting into all this stuff over there. So my challenge to you, and that's why we have that other handout there for you, is how do we teach healthy sexuality to our kids? Because they don't have a clue. They think pornography is sexuality. If you want my notes on pornography, I'm happy to send that to you as well. All right, we have 3 minutes for Q&A. Brett only pays me till 12 o'clock. That's why we will end sharp. Yeah.
Just looking through all the books you have here, and one I think would really be good. I just read it. It's a book by a guy named Sam Albury. I don't think it was Paul, but he is somebody who struggled with same-sex attraction, but he's also a pastor.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book. It's got anti-gay, and it was like 100 and I think maybe 20 pages. It's a short read, I think 120 pages is short. But it's a really, really short read, and it was fantastic. Okay. And so I don't know if that's just an extra thing that.
Yeah, there's a ton of good books. I've just put on the bibliography, my favorites off of my bookshelf, which I'm happy to invest in your ministry by buying you one of those, and because I know they're quality books and that kind of thing. So, yep.
Just going back to the definition of sexual immorality, is that specifically designed to apply to youth that are not married? Is that the modifier you need for the?
No.
Maybe it needs intercourse.
Yeah, intercourse meaning within the biblical context, because
Okay.
we're speaking as Christians, right?
I got you, but within
Yeah.
marriage though.
Yeah.
That's the modifier that would come before the definition.
Yeah.
Have you ever done it I've spent a week with these people. Have you ever gone and just asked how would you define sexual immorality? And I noticed that you said I doubt that you guys could come up with a definition, which piqued my interest. I wonder if we could.
Well, I can only give you this quick illustration.
It's just I know you guys couldn't either.
I've got 22 seminary students at Tyndale, it's now called Tyndale University, whatever it is now. Same scenario. I handed one guy who happened to work with us, I said, I'm going to go down and have a coffee and check out the bookstore. I'll be back in 10 minutes. And I'm sure because you're seminary students, you'll have a working definition for me. And I come back 10 minutes later, and there's nothing on the whiteboard except sexual immorality is. And I just slipped in and sat down and let them wrestle with it a little bit more, to the point where they weren't sure what it was. And I just said to them this, I said, I'm not upset that you don't have a definition. I'm not even surprised that you don't have a definition. I expected you wouldn't have a definition, but I would expect as future youth ministry people, we nail this down so that we know where to set some guidelines and some boundaries for our kids. So, yeah.
And I would just encourage you to maybe do away with that script a little bit, because that, for me, I immediately felt like I was with a group that maybe exists in your memory, but the rest, maybe, you know what I mean by that?
Well, hey, if Brett will give you the time, knock yourself out this afternoon.
Right.
And send it to me so I can put it in my next presentation.
Cool.
Yeah. But I'm just going, most youth ministry people haven't thought about what that is.
For sure.
And so at least it's a starting point to have some, and I say this is how it works. A Christian boy and Christian girl can go to the door, have a little goodnight kiss and a hug, and there is no chemical, physical, emotional thing going on. There's another Christian couple who can go to the door, have a hug, a little kiss, a little deep tongue tonsil hockey, as I call it, and a little squeeze there and a squeeze in there. And there will be, unless the boy is dead, a physiological, biological response starting. And I'm going, that's where you need to be careful.
Well, look at the physiological response when she walks toward the door and actually from the window.
Yeah. Hey. Be very careful. Our time is up. I'll stick around for lunch, and if you want to gab further. So, what's the instructions? We're finished. Lunch is on. I'm buying lunch as well.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.